Court trials have been cancelled across France, and that's another worrying issue across Europe.
Have we seen a reduction in terrorism globally? At least in my region, so I would say in Colombia.
I think we'll see this, the virus continue, well into next year. We're just going to have to cope with this until early 2021.
Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Insight Weekly. Following on from last week's coronavirus special, in which we discussed scenarios, forecasts and analysis from a business, economic and societal perspective. This week we will be getting an update on the potential scenarios and an update from what's been going on in each region. If you would like to share and comment the video, we'd really appreciate it. Feel free to drop us a message, ask the analysts any questions. You might get featured on next week's podcast. So first we will go to Viraj. If you could let us know what's going on in Africa this week.
Sure. So in Africa, 633 cases have been confirmed. In 16 countries, there have been cases of local transmission. But since our last update, African countries have put in place stronger measures. Measures include travel bans or travel restrictions, mandatory self-isolation from people traveling into the country from countries affected by this infection. There have also been bans on large gatherings, including protests. Organizations such as the UN have also put in place measures. So in South Sudan, those workers that are traveling into the country from, places such as Italy or France, they have been barred from entering the country. So the UN have also put measures in place in countries such as South Sudan to prevent the, humanitarian workers bringing the virus into the country. I think this is important, to avoid scenarios such as Haiti, where peacekeepers or humanitarian workers, they brought in cholera, which obviously was its own sort of, disaster as well. There have been reports of panic buying in Ivory Coast, in Kenya, but nothing too major like what we've seen in the West. There have been cases of anti-foreigner sentiment in Ethiopia as well, as the US Embassy reported yesterday. In Kenya, there was a man who was killed. I think this was an isolated incident, but there was a man who was killed by a group of youths in a village in Kwale County, where they accused him of having the virus. I think he was drunk at the time. I think this was an isolated incident. In Niger, there have been no cases, but during the weekend, there were protests because of the preventive measures that the government have put in place. These protests were banned, but they went ahead nonetheless. In the capital, I think 3 people were killed. The UN are sort of projecting that oil exporting countries will lose up to $65 billion in crude oil revenues. They have also projected that GDP growth will fall from 3.2% to about 2%. I think there's also a question about the impact of measures that a lot of these African countries are putting in place. They don't have the when you look at the individual or household level, people don't have the financial capacity that they do in the West. And prolonged disruption, to economic activities will not last until if this continues, if these measures don't work, then we'll see. I think we could see protests, looting. We're not there yet, but in the coming weeks, that's something to look out for. As with the West, I think we're seeing governance putting the spotlight here. So there needs to be buy-in, from the local population. Given the nature of this infection, I think most people, individually, you have to do a lot. You have to think. You have to think about, putting in as an individual. You have to think about sanitation. This is obviously difficult as well, in countries such as Zambia, South Africa even, where power outages, water supply disruptions, this all sort of affects the sort of response measures that these governments put in place. So, I think governance is, definitely going to be challenged in the coming weeks.
Thank you, Viraj. Vincent, what have we seen developing in the Americas?
So this week we've seen quite an increase of cases compared to last week, and I think it's because of a ramp up of testing, particularly in countries like the US, which has seen a sharp increase with a significant amount of cases in the state of New York. Brazil has continued to see a ramp up in cases, Chile, Ecuador, Canada, and now last week there was still quite a few holdouts in the Caribbean and even Central America, but now most countries are affected. There is still a holdout. Haiti hasn't reported any cases, and neither has Dominica. At least in the case of Haiti, I think it's just because of the health capacity and testing, and they just haven't reported any. But there's likely to have been transmission. In terms of responses, we've continued to see travel bans within and between states in the U.S. And between countries. So we've continued to see travel bans put in place between the U.S. and other countries, and Central American banning the entry of foreigners except for their own citizens. We've also seen cities like San Francisco putting shelter-in-place policies to restrict the movement of people and asking people to only go out in case of emergency or for really if it's necessary. In terms of crime, we've continued to see hate crimes targeting Asians. So we've seen it in New York City and San Francisco more often than other places in the U.S., but there's also been in Virginia, there were university students that were targeted by people throwing eggs. Luckily, they've missed, but it was on the campus of one of the universities. So they reported it to the authorities and to the university, saying, please increase security for international students. We've also seen the Korean consulate in Montreal, in Canada, warning people of East Asian descent about potential attacks, and this comes off the back of 2 attacks over the weekend. Included one stabbing and another one which wasn't clear how he was hurt, but he was in critical condition. In South America, we've continued as well to see criminals take advantage of the situation. So we've seen price gouging in Bolivia regarding masks. We've also seen the authorities raid certain criminal establishments that were creating counterfeit hand gel, antibacterial hand gel. The governments, there's also been a crackdown on people who are not self-quarantining. So the last week, I've seen that in Argentina, there's been an increase in arrest of people who have not self-quarantined after coming back from China. Some of them were Chinese owners of supermarkets in Argentina who had come back from China, and then others were from Argentina who may have traveled to Italy or other countries where there were a greater outbreak than Argentina and who were arrested for not respecting the policies put in place. In terms of the economy, like in most regions of the world, it's going to take a greater toll. My worry is for countries like Argentina or Chile. So for Argentina, they've been in a recession for the last 2 years, and the risk of them defaulting on repayments and restructuring their debt is now greater because of this crisis. And in terms of Chile, reliant and Peru, who are reliant quite significantly on the mining sector, with the global economic impact that we're seeing, those sectors might be affected, impacting workers and then impacting the local economy in return. So overall, the situation continues to deteriorate, just like much of the world at the moment.
Thank you, Vincent. And what about in Asia, Matt?
Well, throughout the week, across the region, seeing quite a bit of reporting where the coronavirus is spilling into other sort of long-standing issues or threats. Beginning with China, there was, of course, a senior Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesman who took to Twitter to disseminate an allegation that the coronavirus, in fact, originated from a US military unit which was visiting the country at the time for a competition, which that allegation has of course gained traction and quite a bit of criticism. I believe over in the US, Vince, their Chinese ambassador got summoned to the State Department almost I think it was a day afterwards. And alongside that as well, there's a recent reporting indicating the Chinese government is in the process of stripping the credentials of US journalists based in mainland China, Macau, and Hong Kong. So I suppose what we're seeing from this is that with the lengthy amount of reporting of the origins of the coronavirus and the criticism that's been directed towards the Chinese government. Well, the Chinese government is any sort of criticism being launched at them now seems to be drawing their ire a lot more than usual, and they appear to be taking steps to hit back at any criticism being launched at the Chinese government, regardless of the credibility of any claims made with regards to how the virus originated. Also, with regards to the stripping of credentials of US journalists, if that goes through, there's now would now be a scenario where reporting coming out of China in relation to the developments around the coronavirus probably have to approach it with I suppose a mindset of how much is accurate information, how much is state-run propaganda. Elsewhere across China, India, and Pakistan, there was actually quite a few instances of trafficking of and fake goods as well, like you mentioned for South America. Quite a few instances in China, India, and Pakistan of warehouses being raided with large amounts of illegal supplies of medical goods, face masks, hand gels, etc. Items which are in high demand across the world. In addition, quite a few counterfeit goods being made, counterfeit medical supplies being made, which counterfeit goods has long been a problem across the region, and goes to show that in light of the huge demand for medical goods around the world, it's an ideal opportunity for transnational organised crime. It's almost, I suppose you could call it, a bit of a golden goose at the moment.
And I think on that point, I think we can probably see that there might be a shift in terms of criminal patterns and criminal trends due to this crisis. So people that were smuggling certain items at some point, or drugs, now might be shifting to criminal smuggling medical items, like you were saying, and things like that, taking advantage of this crisis because of opportunity and because the demand is there for people needing those types of supplies, and not just in South America or, in your case, Asia. I think maybe Europe even, the hoarding of goods, the supplying, the price gouging, I think we'll see that, and we have seen it as well.
It certainly seems to be providing a massive opportunity for transnational organised crime. And finally, there was actually an incident in Thailand which actually gained quite a bit of interest. Very recently, there was a complex attack down in southern Thailand at the Southern Border Provinces Administration Centre in the Muang district of Yala Province. Now, from what I can understand of available information, the complex attack wounded 20 people, and it was targeting a meeting of security officials. It was a large gathering of officials trying to come up with strategies of how to combat coronavirus down in the southern regions of Thailand. Now, as far as how the attack occurred, from what we understand, it consisted of either an under-vehicle IED or a vehicle-borne IED detonating, and a grenade, unknown type, being thrown. Unfortunately, wasn't able to determine in what order was it the grenade first, and then the vehicle bomb, or vice versa. Now, southern Thailand, it's had an insurgency going on for a considerable period of time. However, complex attacks are quite rare. In fact, this one appears to be the first for 2020 down in that region. Usually, the insurgents or criminal networks will just engage in either IED attacks or small arms fire. It's very rare they'll engage in complex attacks, and given the timing and the target, it could certainly does appear to be a case where in regions around the world where there's heavy conflict zones, of course this virus is crossing borders, and conflict zones with the lack of healthcare in areas. When officials try and meet to sort of come up with any kind of activities, of course, that would provide a major opportunity for any sort of insurgent groups or terrorist groups to carry out any kind of attack they'd like. It would present a very, very good target for them.
Have we seen a reduction in terrorism globally?
At least in my region, so I would say in Colombia, I have seen quite a lot less attacks, but there's still a few here and there. There was recently a police patrol that was ambushed with an explosive device that wounded 2 police officers. But I think overall, compared to what we saw earlier this year, when we had the Yellen strike and FARC dissidents in January, February, that during that time we saw quite a ramping up of attacks compared to the same period last year. But now, due to this, maybe I haven't put the links on coronavirus to the downwards trends of attacks in Colombia, but I think there's definitely a significant reduction. So is it because reporting is now focused on coronavirus, or is it because there actually is a lack of attacks? That's still up for debate.
I think the issue they've got in Europe is that generally they go after mass gatherings, and mass gatherings have been banned in Europe, so there just isn't that target opportunity for them. So I'd imagine we're going to likely see a lack of terrorism incidents throughout this period.
Yeah.
Leading into Europe then, what else have we seen this week, Michael?
So, generally in Europe, we've seen many borders that have been closed during this period. In Italy, some of the patterns and trends that we've seen are medical supplies being confiscated due to price gouging. We've seen shops that have been selling expired food or food of unknown origin. Arrests of people who are selling masks at a high markup in Rome. We've seen thousands of people who have been cited for actually breaking the lockdown rules, and we've seen that across Europe. We've seen blood deficits in Italy, so there's 10% less blood than is required at the moment, and I imagine that's going to become more widespread across Europe as well as the COVID-19 outbreak really takes hold. We also saw a protest at an Amazon warehouse where somebody tested positive for COVID-19, and it was believed by the staff that Amazon weren't doing enough to actually protect the staff. So moving on to Spain, lots of job losses. We've seen Ford and Seat factories that have closed down production. Spanish government took nationwide control of private hospitals, and the Civil Guard has also requisitioned 150,000 surgical masks. So again, that could be a wider theme across Europe, is that we see the requisitioning of medical equipment to actually cope with this crisis. Spain ordered a nationwide lockdown. We saw many arrests of people who were actually ignoring the emergency rules. And the police clashed with British nationals in Benidorm as they tried to actually disperse them. Moving on to France, again, another lockdown has been put in place that was initially ignored, although it seems likely that people are actually now starting to pay more attention to this lockdown and actually heed the advice of the president. Police, again, have fined thousands of people. There was also more protests at Amazon sites in France. These were more linked to calling on the company to make it easier for staff who don't want to work to not be able to work. Court trials have been cancelled across France, and that's another worrying issue across Europe. This is going to have an impact on the judicial system. So people who are being arrested, what's going to happen to them? Because you can't have trial by jury during this period. So we're going to end up seeing a backup of criminal cases across Europe that has to be dealt with at some point.
We've seen similar things like that in South America. I've seen, either trials completely put off, or at least trying maybe to accommodate via Skype or any other means. But yeah, there's definitely similar trends across the Americas as well.
I mean, it's worrying in terms of, my assessment is that we're going to see an increase in criminality, and if you're going to have an increase in criminality, you're going to have an increase in arrests, then what are they going to do with these people who are arresting? That's a worry for me across Europe.
There was rumors, though, that some police forces may kind of, for the time being, put off certain crimes Is that something that you see in Europe or have heard in Europe?
Yeah, I've seen reports of police are going to essentially not arrest people for low-level criminality, but the worry then is that just saying it's carte blanche for people to go out and commit low-level criminality, because that can't be acceptable.
And is that going to build up? You start with a small crime that's not going to get arrested, and does that build up to something bigger and bigger and bigger?
Do we see vigilante groups that are being formed, like we saw during the 2012 riots, where in London you had shops that were being targeted and you had communities who owned those shops actually banding together and creating vigilante groups? That is a worry as this thing escalates.
It was the same thing with the LA riots when Asian Americans were protecting their shops with guns. And since we saw last week, we mentioned the rise in gun ownership with Asian Americans. Could we, if the situation deteriorates even further, could we see that again in the US? Asian Americans protecting their properties, their shops, against people targeting them because of blame.
Yeah. I mean, the worry for that is as the casualty figures increase, it creates more anger within society that is then directed towards the Asian community, and then we see these sort of flare-ups between communities. That's a real worry as part of this crisis. Yellow Vest protesters were out again last weekend. Now the lockdown has been put in place. It's interesting to see if they're going to be out again this weekend. In Switzerland, there was an interesting incident where hackers have pretended to be from the Federal Office of Health in order to actually infect computers with malware. In Belgium, a woman was assaulted buying the last packet of toilet roll. As ludicrous as it seems, this is happening a lot across Europe where people are being assaulted in supermarkets. In the Netherlands, there were medical supplies that were stolen from hospitals in Amsterdam and Maastricht. In Germany, a left-wing group called the Revolutionary Antibodies online have called for rioting and looting, which is interesting. We've had boxes of disinfectant stolen from police stations. Chancellor Merkel, who warned previously that 60% of Germans could be infected with COVID-19, has now said that this is the biggest crisis that Germans face since World War II. And the country's disease control agency has warned that 10 million Germans could be infected in the next 3 months. Now, the worrying part of that is that if this does have a 1% mortality rate, that's 100,000 people who are going to die. Those figures are accurate. Moving on to Poland, so they've closed all borders, which is slowing down the flow of goods. So you have truck drivers who are backed up in 40-kilometre queues. That is worrying from a logistical point of view. In Europe, we're going to start to see a lack of goods being supplied throughout Europe, which is then going to also feed into the anger of the general public. And also, because Poland has closed their borders, citizens from Baltic countries are struggling to get back to the Baltic countries, which is an issue. In Russia this week, another worrying development. So on Sputnik and Russia 1, they claimed that the British smeared something in Wuhan in the same way that they smeared nerve agent on the Skripal's door handle. So they're referring to the Sergei Skripal, who was a former Russian military intelligence officer, and he was attacked with a chemical weapon by 2 Russian GRU agents. So the worrying part of this for me is that as we see flare-ups of COVID-19 and governments failing to get a grip of it, do they then increase their propaganda and try to blame external forces as the reason why this isn't happening? In China, for example, if we see a relapse of COVID-19, could we see more and more propaganda? And you kind of mentioned it before. And then over to the UK finally. Schools have been closed nationally. London appears to be going into lockdown shortly, with a UK-wide lockdown perhaps as early as next week. We're already seeing looting. So there was a reported incident today of 6 men attempting to loot Sainsbury's of alcohol on New Kent Road. We've seen brawls in supermarkets, numerous reports of job losses, fraudsters who are targeting the elderly, protests by groups by a group called Stop the System, and hate crimes against people of Asian appearance. Particularly we've recorded incidents in Southampton. And the final incident was the first confirmed case of a prisoner testing positive for COVID-19, and that was at Strangeways Prison in Manchester. The worry there is, so in places like Iran and Spain, they've actually released sort of low priority prisoners. So in Iran, they released political prisoners. However, in Italy, due to a mixture of fear of COVID-19 infection and relatives not being able to visit prisoners, we saw riots across Italy in prisons, and we even saw incidents of prisoners escaping from prison. The worry is we see similar incidents across Europe as prisons become infected with COVID-19.
Well, we saw similar just recently. There was about 834 prisoners who escaped from about 5 prisons in the state of Sao Paulo in Brazil. There's already been over 500 recaptured, but they escaped because the courts suspended the temporary release of about 34,000 inmates who were under the semi-open regime of the prison, so where they could go out but then come back. And so, knowing the history of kind of prison violence, prison breakouts in Brazil and things like that, that for me, that's something to keep an eye on, is the situation in those prisons who are overcrowded, and not just Brazil, but over South America, because the conditions in those prisons, overcrowded, crime controls and stuff like that. And so if the suspension of visitors creates anger within the prisoners, because a lot of it is how goods get smuggled in, what's the situation there? So that's interesting. And I was going to ask, in terms of a medical response, so Italy's been overwhelmed. Have countries who are days behind Italy started to see the same patterns and trends? And I ask because in the Americas, there's been reports of doctors saying they've already run out of about 5-6 months worth of supply within a week. So they're trying to figure out new ways to handle that situation. There's been the deployment of a hospital ship, I think, and they're going to deploy the second one to kind of deal with that capacity. And same with Venezuela, where doctors say we don't have the capacity to handle this. And in some states within that country that haven't been affected yet, some doctors say, let's pray that it doesn't come to this state, because if it does, they don't have the equipment or the capacity to handle it.
Yeah, I mean, we've already started to hear second-hand conversations of saying that already hospitals in London are overstretched by this. I think more generally, it's a question that I want to ask. We are professional intelligence analysts. This is what we do for a living. We analyze these situations, and we look at incidents on a regular basis globally. What's our thoughts as to kind of where this is going and how bad this could get?
It's not going to be good. I think overall, for the economy, global recession. We've already seen job losses, as you mentioned before, and we've seen the same in the U.S. At least supermarkets are hiring, but that'll be temporary workers. And so it's the question, what happens after this? Can governments handle the situation where the economy crashes and we still have COVID-19 at the same time? At some point, hard choices will have to be made.
I think also given the the variance in how some economies are more resilient than others. In Africa they're not very resilient. So as I touched on before, I don't think when you look at the shutdowns that you're seeing in Europe, I mean, how long, if an African city was to do that, how long could that last? I don't think it could last too much before we start seeing anger from the local population.
Yeah, I think one thing that's been going through my head with regards to, I suppose, how much the impact could be. I think an interesting development will be to keep an eye on when, this virus will eventually die down. And I suppose what will be interesting to see is when it comes to economic recovery is how states around the world respond to it. For example, I mean, with regards to when the virus initially began to spread throughout China, a major concern was essentially China shutting down completely and thus affecting supply chains around the world. So perhaps one thing that I suppose to keep an eye on will be how would sort of companies, governments around the world, as this virus tends to die down, how will they look to, I suppose, learn the lessons from it and ensure that when the next kind of pandemic breaks out, will they have learned the lessons and essentially made supply chains a lot more resilient to instances like this?
I think
current circumstances.
To bring it back to kind of Michael's question regarding kind of scenarios and things like that, I think regarding the economy, I think that we think of it as it's currently impacting the economy and it's a big slide immediately. But I think once COVID-19, there's response, adequate response, and maybe it's we're fixing things. We got to remember that the economy takes a lot longer to restart. Mm-hmm. So I think we have in Chile, there's been reports of several mines, and in Peru as well, who've kind of stopped operations at least for 15 days for now. But based on my experience of looking at, say, Suriname with illegal miners and mines having to shut down, it takes a month, 2 months to start up again. So if those mines in Chile and Peru stop their operations for longer based because of government actions to quarantine people or to stop movement, how long are they going to have to basically start back up after this situation? And I think that's the same with supply chains, which is why like looting in supermarkets in Europe and the US is just so detrimental. It's just because one empties out the stores, but then once it takes a lot of time to then replenish those supply chains and the stores and back up. So yeah, I think that's the worrying thing, is that once the disease is gone, is how long it takes to kind of ramp back up, if at all possible, depending on how bad the economy gets.
I mean, there's so many knock-on effects, which is the worrying part. It's almost too big for us to kind of really get a hold of at the moment. So, if we take the energy sector, the price of oil at the moment, they're talking about oil and gas companies having to lay off staff, turning to suppliers and asking them for discounts on pricing. But, if you take certain oil sites in Iraq as an example, they will hire local workers. What happens if those local workers have to be laid off? That's going to cause anger amongst the local population. Also, if there's an outbreak of COVID-19 and they link that between Westerners and the outbreak, it could even increase the anger aimed at those oil and gas companies. So there are so many other knock-on effects of this that is the worrying part of it. But I mean, the scenarios that we're working from are, one is the best case, and that is that the response to COVID-19 works and behaviour adapts sufficiently to slow the spread of COVID-19, with some widespread closures are still required, but behavioural changes slow infection rate and keeps the health system working. So that's the best case scenario that we're working from. The medium case is that we have a rolling wave of COVID-19 infections that spike and stress local and regional health systems. Governments take more aggressive steps to enforce social distancing, and a sharp economic growth slowdown ensues, extending through the second quarter. I think we're already at that stage. Yeah. And then the worst case scenario that we're working from is that China suffers a relapse as it ramps up economic activity. The world struggles to contain the spread of the virus, leading to longer pandemic and global recession, leading to multiple quarters of negative earnings growth. And the infection levels are comparable with H1N1 and swine flu. And we see a far higher mortality rate and deaths as a result of this. So what's our kind of thoughts as to what's the most likely at the moment? Do you think we're sitting at the medium case, or is it the worst case? What do we think?
So I think, I don't think we'll see, I think we'll see this, the virus continue, well into next year. I think we're just going to have to cope with this until early 2021. I think it varies from, region to region, country to country, but I think if the epicenter remains in Europe, then we look at, medium case. But if it shifts maybe to the developing world, then worst case even.
Which we're already seeing. We're already seeing it shift towards South America, and there's cases in Africa.
Yeah, I think if it's, if epicenter sort of still remains in Europe, I think we have a chance of restricting the, I think public health officials, they refer to this as, the contact network. So if they can reduce the number of cases that one, an infected individual gives it to others, I think right now it's for every one person who has it, they give it to 2.5 or 3 people. Mm-hmm. I think if they reduce that, then I think it's medium case. I think the aviation industry is really going to struggle for well into next year. I think travel restrictions are going to have to remain. And tourism is obviously going to take a hit as well. I think trade will continue. I don't think freight will be too much affected. Hopefully not, because if that collapses, then we, like Vincent was saying, we see less goods in the store. People hoarding, maybe looting. I don't know. I think we'll also see those that don't have the financial capacity. How will they, if there are no goods in supermarkets, then where do they get their food from as well? So I think trade will have to continue.
The whole normalcy bias seems to have passed now. I've seen, we've obviously been kind of monitoring this now for months, and a couple of weeks ago, the general population was still very much laissez-faire about this. It was everything will be fine. Now I'm seeing videos of people saying I've been made redundant. Last week I was everything was fine. Suddenly things are completely different. So I think the normalcy bias is now past. I think people are starting to get to grips with this is a serious situation, and this is going to get worse, and it's going to be ongoing for at least the next 6 months, if not longer. This seems to me is going to really shift how the world world operates, not just economically, but more broader than that. I think it's going to have more broader impacts.
Well, and I think we're talking about kind of the supply chains and kind of maybe rethinking that. I think it goes to the local versus global debate in terms of now people might think more stringently about manufacturing, about critical supply chains, and do we bring those back to shores, whether it's the US, whether it's the UK or whatever, or do we continue being so global? And I think there's certain political parties, certain politicians who will grab onto that debate to kind of, because this situation will shift people's mindsets and we might see political shifts within certain countries as well because of it, because of this crisis, and because people see how unprepared and we are, and just you really see the global aspect of it, of every sector. And so it makes people think, how do we handle this in the future better?
Yeah, I mean, manufacturing of medical goods, I think, that is top of the list for people, politicians thinking, should this be done within our country, that we actually have some sort of control over it? It's just whether or not we now see a rise in, populist governments, and they use this as part of their push to actually bring back more manufacturing into more nationally rather than having this globalized economy.
So as you can kind of see from the conversation today, Intelligence Fusion does not just report the newly reported cases with regards to the coronavirus outbreak, but we're looking at this from a much wider perspective and kind of analysing it from business, societal, economic perspective in order to best advise our clients and help them make better decisions surrounding this pandemic. We are still offering kind of emergency temporary access to the Intelligence Fusion platform. If you'd like to speak to us further about getting access to that, then drop us a message. We'll leave a link in the comments section and to take you straight to the page there so you can get in touch. And yeah, that's it from us this week. And we'll be back next week with another update on the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you very much.